The co-op yard was full of the new hybrid seed the first warm Saturday of that spring, stacked on pallets under the awning in bright waxed bags with a green ear of corn printed on the side, and half the county was there to buy it and stand around and talk about how tall it would grow, when Ellis Renfro backed his old flatbed up to the loading dock, dropped the tailgate, and began carrying his own saved seed corn out in feed sacks stained the color of the crib it had wintered in, ear-run yellow flint that he had shelled by hand off his own stalks the fall before, to store in the co-op's cool bin, the way he did every year. Delmar Suggs was leaning on the pallets of the new seed with 3 other men, and Delmar was the man on that end of Tolliver County whose opinion decided what an opinion was. 1,100 acres of corn on the flat, and a seat on the co-op board and the seed committee and the bank, and he watched Ellis carry the dull sacks past the bright bags, and he said it loud enough to carry, kindly, the way Delmar said everything. That there went the last man in the county still planting his granddaddy's corn, that Ellis Renfro was going to be out there in July with a crop a full head shorter than everybody else's, throwing away 30 bushels an acre to save the price of a bag of seed, and would somebody explain to him that a new hybrid ear had more corn on it than the whole county grew when they were boys. The men laughed, not cruelly, because none of them were cruel, and Ellis set the last sack in the bin and signed the tag in the small square hand of a man who had kept his own books for 40 years, and drove home to Cut Bank Road, and that afternoon the co-op yard only laughed. 5 months later, on the far side of the worst wind that country had seen in a lifetime, 4 of those same men would drive up Ellis Renfro's lane one at a time to ask him to sell them seed, and Delmar Suggs would sit in his truck at the top of the hill for the better part of an hour before he could make himself come down. Understand what open-pollinated corn is, because the whole story sits on it. Before there was a seed company, before there was a hybrid, a man grew his corn, and every fall he walked his own field and picked the best ears off the best stalks, the ones that stood up straight and held their ears high and dry and came through the wind on their own 2 feet, and he saved those ears back and shelled them and planted them the next spring, and that corn was his, bred to his ground and his weather across the years by his own eye and his own hand, and it bred true, which means the corn that grew from it was the same corn, and a man never bought a bag of seed in his life. Then the seed companies bred the hybrid, and a hybrid is a cross made fresh every year between 2 parent lines. And the first year it grows you a taller plant with a bigger ear and more bushels than the old corn ever dreamed of, and it is a real and true thing, and Ellis never once said it wasn't. But a hybrid does not breed true. Save the seed off a hybrid and plant it, and you get a wild, ragged field of every kind of corn its grandparents ever were, tall and short and barren. So a man who plants hybrid buys his seed new every single spring for the rest of his life, out of a bag, from a company, at whatever the bag costs that year, and he does it because the extra bushels more than pay for the bag. In a fair year, on a calm year, in the years the weather lets a tall, top-heavy plant stand up long enough to be picked. And Ellis Renfro had been born on Cut Bank Road and raised by a grandfather who saved his own seed, and he had spent the first 20 years of his life walking a cornfield every October behind an old man who stopped at certain plants and not others and taught the boy why. And he had watched all his life the one thing about the old flint corn that no bag of hybrid on that dock could give a man, which was that it stood. It was a short corn and a thick corn, stalk like a man's wrist and roots that went down after water instead of sipping it off the top, and it had been bred for 80 years off the plants that came through wind on their feet, because every stalk his people ever saved seed from was by definition a stalk that was still standing in October when they walked out to pick it. And the ones the wind laid down never made it into the seed crib and never bred another plant, and that is a kind of breeding too, done by the weather, one bad year at a time. Ellis's grandfather had worn a saying out on him before he was grown, standing in the field with a good ear in his hand, which was that corn that can't stand on its own 2 feet isn't yours. It belongs to the wind, and the wind always comes to collect. Ellis had married a school teacher named Orpha and farmed the home place for 40 years, corn on the high rolling ground and hay in the draws, and he had watched the whole county go to hybrid the way you watch a tide come in. One neighbor, and then two, and then all of them, until he was the only man in Tolliver County still carrying his own dull sacks past the bright bags every spring. Orpha had died 2 winters back, and Ellis had buried her up on the hill where you could see the whole home place, and he had gone on saving his seed and doing the arithmetic on it alone at the kitchen table, and he knew to the dollar what the county did not, which is what a man spends across 40 years buying seed out of a bag every spring that he could have grown for nothing. There was a man named Tobias Fenn on the next ridge over who had saved his own seed too, an old open pollinated dent he had bred to his own ground for the better part of 40 years, and Tobias had died that same winter, and when they had the sale to settle his place, the seed crib was the one thing at that auction nobody wanted. There it was, 80 bushels of hand-picked open pollinated seed corn, 40 years of one man's eye, and the auctioneer could not raise a bid on it, because every man in that yard bought his seed from a company now and would no more plant a dead man's saved corn than plow with a mule. And Tobias's widow, Alfreda Fenn, stood there in her good coat while a man from the seed committee told her, meaning it kindly, that the only thing to do with that crib was burn it and be shut of it. Ellis Renfro bought it instead. He gave Alfreda Fenn $2 a bushel for 80 bushels of seed the whole county called trash, $160, real money laid in a widow's hand for corn that was being given away, and he hauled it home to Cut Bank Road. And Delmar Suggs heard about it at the corner table in the diner and shook his head and said, not unkindly, that Ellis had finally gone all the way sentimental, that a man his age had no business buying a dead man's corn to add to his own dead granddaddy's corn, and that the 2 old fields of Flint together still wouldn't outbushel one good hybrid acre. His son said the funnier thing, the one that stuck. Royce Suggs stood up at the counter and held his hand flat at his own chest to show how short the Renfro corn grew, and walked between the tables stooped over like a man ducking under a low door, and after that Ellis Renfro did not grow corn any more. He grew the dwarf field. And the whole county called it that before the corn was even in the ground, the dwarf field, the seed corn museum, and men would slow their trucks on Cut Bank Road in July just to look at the short crop and grin. But here's what Ellis did with Tobias Fenn's 80 bushels, and it is the thing nobody up there understood. He did not just dump it in with his own and plant it. He kept it separate, and that first spring he planted the Fenn dent along one whole side of his own Flint, 2 old saved corns side by side, and all that summer he walked between them the way his grandfather had walked, and where the 2 crossed on the wind he watched what came of it, because a man who saves his own seed is not growing a crop, he is keeping a line, and a new line brought in from a neighbor's 40 years of breeding is a thing you fold in slow and on purpose, ear by ear, and never all at once. That was the first thing the county could not see, that the short raggedy dwarf field on Cut Bank Road was not one careless old man's stubbornness, but 2 men's whole lives of picking the right ear off the right stalk, and Ellis carried it forward the same as always. He planted thin. That was the second thing, and the thing that looked to the county like a man too cheap or too old to farm right, that Ellis dropped his corn 1/3 fewer plants to the acre than the hybrid men crowded onto theirs. The seed company told a man to plant his hybrid thick, crowd the plants in shoulder to shoulder to get the bushels. And a thick planted corn grows tall and slender, reaching up past its neighbors for the light, and it puts its roots down shallow because there is no room, and it is a taller, heavier plant on a smaller foot, and in the fair calm year it pays every time the wind does not come. Ellis planted thin, so his corn had room to be what it was. Short and stout, with a wide crown of brace roots gripping down into the ground like a hand, each stalk standing on its own foot with air and light all around it, and he gave up bushels to do it, gave them up on purpose every single year, and wrote the lower number down in his book without one word of complaint, because he was not growing bushels, he was growing a plant that stood. He walked the field before every harvest, That was the third thing, and the thing that made no sense to a single soul up there, that in the first cold week of October, before he picked an ear to eat or sell or store, Ellis Renfro walked every row of his corn on foot with a ball of twine, and he tied a length of twine on the plants he meant to save seed from, and he chose them by rule. Not by the biggest ear, never only by the biggest ear. He chose the stalks that stood dead straight with no lean in them at all. He chose the ones whose roots had not heaved when the summer storms came through, the ones still square on their feet in October when a third of the field around them had taken some tilt off the August weather. He chose the plants that held their ear high and turned down and dry so the rain ran off it and the mold never got in. He would pass a stalk with a monster ear on it and tie no twine on it at all because the stalk leaned, and he would tie twine on a plainer ear beside it because that stalk had come through everything on its own 2 feet. And any man watching would have said he was picking the wrong corn, and any man watching would have been looking at bushels while Ellis was looking at 40 years down the road. He shelled his seed off the tied plants alone. The rest of the field he picked and sold and fed like any corn, but the seed crib got only the ears off the stalks that stood. And by that one rule, held for 40 years and his grandfather's 40 before that, the Renfro corn had been bred a little truer every single year toward a plant the wind could not lay down, and the county had watched him do it for 4 decades and called it a hobby. He did not do it alone that fall. There was a girl named Junie Ashworth, 22 years old, who ran the scale down at the co-op elevator for wages and weighed every load of grain that came through Tolliver County, and she had known Ellis since she was small, since a day he had stopped on the road and changed a tire for her mother in the rain and never mentioned it after. Her own father had planted 300 acres of hybrid on rented ground below the Suggs place, and everybody in the county knew how thin that was stretched. She came out to Cutbank Road on a Saturday to help Ellis walk the seed rows because she was curious, and she came back the next Saturday and the one after that, and Ellis paid her in cash and dinner and the answer to every question she asked, and she asked good ones. She learned his rule in an afternoon and got sharp at it, sharper than he expected, and by the second Saturday she was tying twine on plants he had to walk back and study before he agreed she was right. She had weighed hybrid corn across that scale for 4 years, and she had never once thought about where the seed for it came from. That it came new in a bag every spring from a company and went back into the ground it could never be saved out of, and Ellis stood in the October field and told her the plain thing his grandfather told him, that there are 2 ways to have corn. You can buy it every year of your life, or you can be its keeper. And only one of those, a bad year, can take clean away from you. Junie heard the men call it the dwarf field every week of that fall down at the elevator and never once carried a word of it back up the road, which at 22 is harder than it sounds. The county agent came out in August of the second summer, a woman named Verna Otley, who drove the whole county looking at corn and knew more about it than anybody, and she walked the dwarf field for the better part of an hour and did not say much while she did it. What she found she gave to Ellis straight at the tailgate. The field was sound, the stand was even, the roots were deep and square. The stalks were thick down low where a stalk needs to be thick, and in a county where she spent every August looking at tall, crowded hybrid pushed hard on fertilizer and standing up mostly on habit, this short old field was the best rooted corn she had put her hands on all year. And then she told him the honest hard thing too, because she liked him, which was that sound did not mean rich, that his neighbor's tall crop would outbushel his by a third in any ordinary fall, that the elevator paid by the bushel and did not pay 1 cent extra for a plant that stood, and that the smart money in Tolliver County, whatever its roots looked like, was still the tall hybrid in the bright bag. Ellis asked her one question. He asked her whether, in all the years she had driven that county, she had ever once seen the tall hybrid tested by a real wind, a straight hard wind out of the northwest in the milk. And Verna Otley stood there a second and said that no, they had been lucky, that the county had not had a wind like that since before the hybrid came in, and that she did not like to think about what the new tall corn would do in one. Ellis said that was the only test his corn was bred to pass, and that he would trade her a third of his bushels every year of his life to own the one field in the county still standing on the morning after a wind like that. And Verna wrote something in her own book and did not argue. Word of the elevator numbers got around, because the scale is a public thing, and everybody knew Ellis Renfro's dwarf field weighed light, a third light, load for load against the tall corn, and Delmar Suggs said at the corner table that it proved what he had said all along, that sentiment was a luxury and Ellis was paying for his. And the men nodded, because it was kind, and it was final, and it settled the thing. Royce did the stooping walk between the tables again and got his laugh. And up on Cutbank Road, Ellis Renfro shelled his seed off the tied stalks and wrote the light number in his book without a word, and folded a little more of the fen dent into his flint the way you bring a new strain into an old family, and slept fine. Here is what was in Ellis Renfro's book by the end of that second winter, and here is why he kept it. He had grown 2 crops of corn on the home place, and he had bought, all in, across both of those years, not one single bag of seed, because every kernel he put in the ground came out of his own crib off his own stalks, and cost him nothing but the walking and the shelling. He knew, because he had kept his own books for 40 years, exactly what the tall corn cost a man in Tolliver County, the seed bought new every spring at bag price whether the year was good or bad, and the heavy fertilizer it took to push a plant that tall, and the note carried at the bank against a standing crop, and he knew that a man who does not charge himself for the seed he has to rebuy every spring of his life is not keeping books, he is telling himself a story. He wintered alone in the house on Cutbank Road with the crib full and the numbers written down in the square hand, and in February, when the seed catalogs came in the mail the way they came to every farm in the county, thick and bright and full of promises, Ellis Renfro used them to start the stove, and did not feel he had lost a thing. Junie Ashworth came up on the cold Saturdays to help him grade the crib seed, and she asked him one afternoon why, if it was so plain, the whole county had gone the other way. And Ellis told her the truest thing he knew, that the other way was easier and richer nearly every year, and that a way which pays 9 years in 10 will win every argument at a corner table, and that the 10th year does not come to the table to argue, it comes on a straight wind out of the northwest and settles the thing without a word. Junie wrote that down herself in the back of Ellis's book and turned the page. Then came the third summer and the wind. It had been a wet, warm year, a growing year, the kind of year that shoots hybrid corn up tall and lush and heavy, and by the first week of August the tall fields of Tolliver County stood 11 and 12 feet high, dead green and loaded, the best-looking crop the county had grown in 20 years, ears filling in the milk. And every man who drove past the dwarf field on Cutbank Road that August grinned a little harder, because the Renfro corn stood barely 8 feet, short and thick and plain, beside all that tall green money, and it had never looked more like a joke. Delmar Suggs stood in his own field the second week of August with his son and looked up at corn that came up over both their heads and said it was the year that finally proved it, that a tall crop was a rich crop, and that old Ellis had thrown away a third of every harvest for 40 years chasing a wind that never came. The wind came on the 9th of August. It came up out of the northwest in the late afternoon in a hard, flat line the color of a bruise. No funnel in it, no twist, just a straight wall of wind that came across the county at better than 90 miles an hour and did not let up for 40 minutes, a wind the old men would spend the rest of their lives measuring other winds against. And it went across the tall corn of Tolliver County like a hand laid flat on a field of grass. Understand what that wind did, because the wind is not the story, the wind is only the bill coming due. A tall plant crowded thick on a shallow foot has nothing to hold it but the grip of its roots and the strength of its lower stalk. And the seed company had bred the hybrid for the ear and the height and the bushel, and let a man push it tall and thin, and it had stood all those years because the wind had been kind, and on the 9th of August the wind was not kind. The tall corn went down, It went down across the whole county in the space of one afternoon. Whole sections of it, flattened in one direction like a carpet rolled out, root-lodged where the shallow roots tore clean out of the wet ground, and green snapped where the stalk broke off clean below the ear because a tall stalk pushed hard snaps before it bends, and by dark on the 9th of August, the finest-looking corn crop Tolliver County had grown in 20 years lay flat in the mud with its ears in the dirt. And the wet did the rest of it. A flattened ear lying in August mud does not dry and does not fill. It molds and it sprouts right there on the ground, the kernels swelling and rotting in the shuck. And a combine cannot pick up corn that lies flat. The header rides over the top of it and leaves it lying. So a man with a down field had to choose between leaving the crop to rot where it fell or crawling the combine at a snail's crawl and salvaging a broken third of it full of mud and mold that the elevator would dock to nothing or turn away at the pit. The word total started getting used at the corner table in a flat voice by men who had never once used it about their own crop. Now understand what that did. Because a whole county's year was standing in that tall corn, and a tall crop flat in the mud is not a harvest, it is a debt with the ears rotting off it. And in the last weeks of August, the men of Tolliver County walked their flattened fields and did the arithmetic, the seed bought new in the spring at bag price. The fertilizer that had pushed the corn so tall, the note at the bank against the crop, all of it laid out flat in the mud in one afternoon, and it was nobody's fault, and it was everybody's. And there was not one particle of malice left in the county, only wind and rain and 40 years of arithmetic coming true at once. And up on the high rolling ground on Cutbank Road, the dwarf field did not know anything had happened. Ellis Renfro's short, thick corn had bent in that wind and stood back up. It stood on its own 2 feet on a wide foot of deep brace roots, planted thin with room to be strong, bred for 40 years, and his grandfather's 40 before that, off nothing but the stalks that came through windstanding, and on the morning of the 10th of August. While every tall field in the county lay flat and sprouting in the mud, the whole 8-foot dwarf field on Cutbank Road stood square and green and ear high in the sun, hardly a stalk of it down. And the mold never touched an ear because every ear was still up in the air where it belonged. Royce Sugg saw it first, and he saw it from the road. His father had sent him up the county in the first light of the 10th to see how far the wind had reached, and he stopped his truck at the top of Ellis Renfro's lane and sat there with the engine running for a long time, because from that rise you could see both things at once. Below him, spread across the flat, his own family's 1,100 acres of tall hybrid lay flat and broken in one direction all the way to the far tree line, a whole year, and the best-looking crop in 20 of them rolled out in the mud with the ears going under. Above him, on the other side of one fence, stood 8 feet of short, thick, plain old flint corn, square on its feet, ears up and dry, hardly bent, the dwarf field, the seed corn museum, the joke the whole county had grinned at for 3 years, standing in the sun on the morning after the worst wind any of them ever saw, as if the wind had been a rumor. Same wind, same county, same wet, warm year. He did not say anything to anybody about it for a good while. Verna Otley said hers first, because she was the one driving the whole county in the last weeks of August, looking at flattened corn with nothing in her book that could stand it back up, and she stopped at Cutbank Road on a Thursday and leaned on Ellis Renfro's tailgate and said it plain. She said she had told him a year ago that the smart money was the tall hybrid, and that she had been wrong, and that the short, deep-rooted plants he had been tying twine on for 40 years off the stalks that stood were the whole reason his field was the only corn left standing on its feet in Tolliver County, and she wanted that written down in his book in her own hand. Delmar Suggs took until the last Sunday in August. He was a good man, and he had been wrong for 3 years running, and both of those stayed true the whole time, and it cost him more to drive up that lane than it cost any of the others. He had lost the whole 1,100 acres flat, he had a note at the bank against a crop that lay rotting in the mud, and he did not know yet how he was going to plant in the spring. and he sat in his truck at the top of Ellis Renfro's hill for the better part of an hour before he could make himself come down, and Ellis saw him up there and let him sit. Because he had watched Delmar coming for 3 years, and he was not going to make it easy or hard, only quiet. Delmar stood in the yard with his hands in his pockets and said he had come to ask a thing and would take it kindly if Ellis did not enjoy it too much, and Ellis told him he was too old to enjoy anything that had taken 3 years and cost the county its crop to arrive. What Delmar wanted was seed. He wanted to buy Ellis Renfro's saved flint and cross it into whatever he could rebuild, to breed the short stalk and the deep foot, and above all the standing into a farm that the wind had just finished teaching him it could lay flat any August it took a mind to. And he stood there in the yard and said the thing that cost him the most, that he had been the man in the county whose whole job it was to know better, and that he had stood at that co-op dock 3 springs running and helped the whole county laugh at the last man still carrying his own seed, and had not understood one thing he was looking at. Ellis sold him seed. He sold Delmar Suggs good sound saved seed at a fair price and not $1 over it, and he would not take his money at all for the other thing Delmar needed, which was to know how it was done, and he spent an afternoon walking Delmar's flattened field with him and telling him what to change. Plant it thinner and let it stand on its own foot. Quit pushing it tall for a bushel count that a single wind could take back in 40 minutes. Save your own seed off the plants that stood so the wind does your breeding for you 1 year at a time. And stop paying a company every spring for corn that could never once save itself. Delmar did most of it that next year and the years after, and his farm came back slower than he wanted and surer than he had any right to. Shorter corn on it now, and his own seed crib filling in the crib where the bright bags used to stack, and the wind never laid him out flat like that again. Junie Ashworth quit the co-op scale that fall. She took 40 bushels of Ellis Renfro's saved seed on a handshake and a note she paid down over 3 years, and she put it in the ground on the rented acres her father had nearly lost, and Ellis drove down in the spring to look at it standing thin and square and short the way he had taught her, and the young woman had to go check on something in the barn for a minute. That fall, Ellis Renfro brought in the only full, clean corn crop in Tolliver County, standing corn picked, standing the way corn is meant to be picked. And when he hauled the first load down to the co-op, the yard went quiet the way a yard goes quiet. And Junie Ashworth waded across the scale and wrote the number on the ticket and did not trust her voice to say it out loud, because it was a full weight off a field the whole county had called the dwarf field, off ground that had given up 1/3 of its bushels every year for 40 years to buy the one thing no bushel can buy, which is a plant that is still on its feet the morning after. Booth Yarrow, who managed the elevator and had bought and graded corn in that county for 30 years and had spent that whole miserable autumn turning wagon loads of mud-caked sprouted hybrid away from the pit or docking it to nearly nothing, stood at the rail while Ellis's clean corn ran into the bin and said to nobody that he had told half the men in the county for years that the smart corn was the tall corn, and that he had been wrong every year he said it, and that he wanted it known he had been wrong. He did not have to say it. But he was the kind of man who said a thing like that out loud when it was true, and it went around the county in his voice, which carried further than Ellis Renfro's ever would, because Ellis was not going to say one word of it himself. Ellis sold saved seed over the next 2 springs to better than 50 farms across 4 counties, and clear down into the flat wind country to the south, where a standing corn was worth more than a tall one, and every load of seed went out his lane with a page he had typed himself and run off at the library, and the page said what to do and, more to the point, what not to do. Plant it thin and let it stand alone. Walk your field before harvest and save seed only off the plants that came through the wind on their feet. Choose the stalk that stood, not the biggest ear. Put your roots down deep by planting thin, not shallow by planting thick. Be your own seed's keeper so no bad year and no company can take your corn clean away from you. And at the bottom of the page, the one line on it that was not an instruction was the thing his grandfather used to say in the October field with a good ear in his hand, that corn which cannot stand on its own 2 feet is not yours. It belongs to the wind, and the wind always comes to collect. The 2 old fields never left Cutbank Road. That was the part the county came to like best. That Ellis Renfro never planted 1 acre of hybrid in his life. Not one, not ever. That the same flint his grandfather bred and the fendent he bought off a widow for $2 a bushel grew on the home place every summer of his life, short and thick and plain, bending in the August winds and standing back up. And every fall he walked the rows with a ball of twine and tied it on the stalks that stood. The same rule held 1 more year. They never once out-busheled the tall corn in a fair year and never would, and every July the trucks still slowed on the road to look at the short crop. But they did not grin anymore, because half the standing corn in 4 counties traced back now to a seed crib a room full of men had told a widow to burn, and there were short, deep-footed fields on 50 farms that had come off Ellis Renfro's ground, and every one of them stood in the wind. Alfreda Fenn heard, before she died, that her husband's 40 years of saved corn had not been burned after all, but was growing on half the farms in 4 counties and had come through the worst wind in a lifetime standing. And she wrote Ellis a short note in a shaky hand that he kept in his book. And that is as much of that as needs telling. If you have stayed with him this far, you already know this was never about corn. Ellis Renfro is the reason there is short-standing seed corn on nearly every place on that end of the county now, and he never made a speech about it, and he never once said "I told you so" to a man who had laughed at him, and to the day he quit driving he would tell you flat that he had not been smart, he had only been raised by a man who saved his own seed and taught him that a plant which cannot stand up on its own is not an asset but a loan, and that the wind is the one lender that always, sooner or later, calls the note. He was laughed at for 3 years by good men who were not being cruel, only certain, and he was proven right in 40 minutes by a wind that did not care about any of them, and in between he did nothing but walk his rows, tie his twine, plant thin, save the stalks that stood, and carry his own dull sacks past the bright bags every spring, while people who liked him grinned. That is all competence ever is. It is the small right thing done the plain old way on the day it is due for 40 years while the whole county laughs and buys its corn out of a bag. So tell me which one you would have been that Saturday on the co-op dock. There were only 2 kinds of men in that yard, and neither kind was a bad man. The ones who looked at a short, dull sack of saved corn and saw a stubborn old fool throwing bushels away, and the one who looked at the same sack and saw the only corn in the county that could stand up on its own 2 feet in a wind that had not come yet. Be honest about it. Most of us are the first kind, and the first kind is not stupid, it is only certain, and certain is the most expensive thing a person can be. Write down in the comments which one you were, and tell me what part of the country you are reading this from, because I read every one of them and I like knowing where you all are sitting tonight. Next time, I want to tell you about the woman on the far side of that same county who dug a pond nobody thought she needed in a year everybody swore it would never stop raining, and what her neighbors came to ask her the summer it finally terribly did. And if this one got to you, send it to somebody who has been told that the old careful way they do a thing, the slow way, the way that gives up a little every year to be sure, is a waste of good money. Up on the high ground on Cutbank Road, an hour before dark, a gray-headed man in a worn canvas coat walks out between 2 rows of short, thick corn with a ball of twine in his pocket he does not really need yet, and he stops at a plain plant standing dead straight after a hard summer, and he ties the twine on it, and he saves it 1 more year.